Alright, so I want to take some time to show you some of the pieces that we've already looked at. Alma Del Cor is going to be our first one. I want to show you how you can use Shenkerian analysis on these particular pieces. Some ideas that you know from the Fort reading are Ursatz, Urlinie, and Bassbrechung. These are the German words that Schenker used, and a lot of times we're going to use the English translation of those things. Fundamental structure, and that has two parts: fundamental line and the bass arpeggiation. Same ideas, these are just the translation. The nature of these words show that the Ursatz has two aspects. One is melodic and one is harmonic. It seems like it's focused on the bass, and it is, but the bass is viewed as support for the harmony. We'll also come across this idea of interruption, which is when this progression in the melody and progression in the harmony in tandem stop short of their goal. Now we know how these things work. In melody you want to get to scale degree 1. Schenker's going to say the most conclusive way to do that is to go down by step to the 1. So when you interrupt a fundamental line, it means you don't get the 1 and you stop short. That's the bow retake symbol that is associated with interruption. We use it just to indicate that there's some kind of a break in the music. Bassbrechung, the bass arpeggiation, is also interrupted. When you stop there, instead of going on to the 1 that you expect. So the bass arpeggiation is basically 1-5-1, that harmonic progression with a lot of stuff inserted at the foreground as the music actually presents it. But sort of the pillars, the structure that holds up a phrase, so to speak, is the 1 at the beginning and then the 5-1 at the end. Or if it's a half cadence, in other words if there's an interruption, you stop short of that 1 and you end on the 5. Melodically speaking, the simplest line is to do 3-2-1. So a direct route down to your tonic. Scale degree, we're interrupting it if there's an interruption. So it's really both things. So you see how in a Shenkerian way of looking at things, these two are in counterpoint with one another, the harmony and the melody, and important things can happen to disrupt your path toward closure, but everything is about how you get there. Interruption is just significant because it's a way of keeping you from getting to that goal. Okay, now look over at this piece. The first thing you want to know is where the cadence points are. So I would want to know that there's a break here. We've got a half cadence. First of all, we're in E major, and so when you see that you get here to the B, we've got our half cadence. Now I'm going to assume that you basically know this phrase because we've worked on it. If you're in the class, you did it for our first assignment. You analyze this thing, so you know that's a half cadence, and you know there's a perfect authentic cadence here. That means we're going to have an interruption going on there, and then for the final second phrase, we're going to get to the goal, which is tonic. Tonic as a scale degree, and tonic as a chord. So let's just take that first phrase and try and think in terms of a Shenkerian mindset. If this is the structure and this is the music, we got to get between the two. We've got to say these are the essentials for closure, for progression, a sense of progression melodically and harmonically. How does this music elaborate on those basic materials? The first thing we got to notice is that they're not always going to start on scale degree 3. A piece does not have to start there, but it can start on any note within the tonic triad. And in this case, we're going to start on scale degree 5 right here, and I'll put a big stem on that. We'll use stems to just call attention to notes. And so I'm saying, hey, that's an important note, scale degree 5. But I personally go to the end and work backwards. So if everything's about goals and getting there, the process, then to know where that goal is and work backwards will give me that's the big picture fast. It can be that you set up scale degree 5 and then you go somewhere else and then depart from it with a stepwise kind of progression. in which case we would say, oh, it's not really departing from that 5. We get to this note, and then we get the stepwise descent. So instead of flailing around at the beginning, go to the end and work backwards. Here the goal is, melodically speaking, F sharp, so I'll put a stem on that one to pull it out. Now I'm basically going to look backwards for stepwise connections into it. Not just any note, it's got to be a note that's got some kind of harmony to support it. Hopefully you've got this already in mind as the chord progression in this bar. 4, 7 diminished 6, and 1. So I'm looking backwards for a stepwise connection, and I find one, and I can stem it because that note is part of this chord. E, G sharp, B, the tonic triad. It's supported, is how we speak of that. It's stable. That makes this an escape tone. It is not stemmed. It's embellishing. And we would show that by slurring it. Now the slur's already in the score, but slurs show belonging. In this case it's belonging because there's a stepwise connection back to the more stable note. That note, the escape tone, in a sense belongs to the G sharp in front of it. Now we'd like more. We'd like stepwise motion as far back as we can go. So I'm going to go back another step and do this note. Now, can I stem it? Well, we've got to check. Is that supported by the harmony? Is it a part of the harmony there? And yes, it is. This is a 7 chord, 7, 2, 4. That's the scale degree content. And there's our 4, part of that chord. Now you can see that we do have a way of getting down from this note. This note is called the Kopf tone in German, but that just means the head tone. Usually in English we say the primary tone. It's that high note that's the point of departure for the fundamental line. We only know that it's the departure, the point of departure, once we see where that line goes. So that's why I go to the back and then I go to the end of the phrase and then work backwards. For this descent we do that, and a lot of times we'll write scale degrees up above, but that's not necessary. It's interrupted there. It does not go to scale degree 1. It's a half cadence. So we write the interruption sign. Later on I've already written this in, but it does go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and gets there. It gets to the goal of scale degree 1. In this first phrase, however, we don't get there. Now harmonically, I know there's a lot more work to do here, because when we're done, just so you know the end game here, when we're done, we should be able to have every note related to other notes. In other words, everything has to be seen as an elaboration of something else unless you get back down to the tonic triad, which is the most stable thing going. So eventually we're going to show how all these notes relate to one another, how they all, in particular, how they relate back to this line that we've pulled out. But I'm going to go to the bass so that we can illustrate the Bassbrechung, or the bass arpeggiation. What we're looking for, because it's an interruption, is an opening tonic and our goal of 5. This is going to be pretty easy if you use your phrase model kind of thinking. I've just copied down some work that I hope you've already got down on your sheet, which is tonic is expanded, prolonged, stretched out, and elaborated by this passing chord, 7 diminished 6. For a Shenkerian kind of analysis, you use slurs to show belonging. Not this kind of belonging here, where it's an embellishment, a dissonance related back to a consonant. But here I'm going to say these two notes belong together because they both belong to the tonic triad. 1 to 3, that's just changing my 1 to a first inversion 1 chord. This then, I don't have to write a P on there. Just from that symbol I know that that's passing. This 7 diminished 6 is a passing chord. Okay, now I stem the main chord. You know, I'm not going to choose this, that's passing. I'm not going to choose this because it's less stable than the root position. So I choose the most stable thing, stem it, and then I know that it basically went like this. From a generative kind of approach, I say, I start with a tonic. If I'm Caldara, you know, I start with this tonic, I invert it, and then I fill in that interval with passing motion, harmonize it, and I get these chords. That's the sort of generative thinking. We're, in a sense, we're going to prune this thing back. We're going to reduce it to its basics. But that's only because we will then want to see how it fleshes out in the actual music in front of us. All right, so back to finding the structural framework, sort of the skeleton behind this organism. Okay. We've got a goal of the dominant. So that's our 5 right there. We've got an embedded progression, so motion to tonic that does not cadence there. Now tonic is the goal of that little motion there, so I'll stem it. This 7 chord could be related over to here. In other words, it's like an incomplete neighbor into that tonic chord. Usually what happens is we try and, it's kind of like the Borg. It assimilates as much as it can, and dominants are like that. They assimilate chords around them. See how these were all assimilated by the 1? These can be grouped up together because there's so much in common between, it's usually 2 and 5 are the ones that tend to do this. But here too we can say, okay, that's a 4 chord, but I'm gonna view this as related to the 7 diminished 6. There are some other ways you could take it. You could think of this as if it were kind of like an escape tone from this scale degree 3 over here. You could do that. I think it's more, it belongs more to the things that follow. In other words, it belongs over here rather than backwards over there. Okay, so now, if I'm going to say that, if I want to pull that out and show that it's this note that I think is more stable than that, and that's elaboration, I'll stem one of them, and then I've clarified which note is more stable, more vital, more essential to the phrase. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't know which one is more stable than the other, or more important than the other. Okay, so now I realize that this whole thing has taken me right back to tonic, and I can view all of this motion in here as elaboration of what could have just been one big 1 chord going through that whole passage. Alright, so I see it as 1 expanded and going to 5. The main notes are pulled out by really long stems, smaller stems, and 8th note kinds of symbols represent things that are important but not at the level of these long stem things. Okay, and then back to the melody. We've already started fleshing this out quite a bit. Let's do the same for the melody here. Alright, this is all tonic for these first 2 beats. So I'm going to show that these 2 guys belong to one another. They belong to the same triad. Then these guys belong together, and in fact this might be best yet to just see that B comes back. And I can do both those because those slurs all say the same thing. They belong to the same chord. Now there's passing motion here just like there was passing motion there. And I don't have to write a P because it's assumed. If I have a third with a slur across it and a note in the middle like that, we know it's passing. We're back on the 1/6 in this measure. And see how much harmony influences melody? That's why I kind of get the big picture here and then go there. Because the 2 are really working together in tandem. And so you kind of have to play one off the other. That's really the whole idea here, is that the urzats, this fundamental structure, is both melody and harmony working together in counterpoint with one another. So it's nice that this slur here is matched by something up there. That's sort of desirable that they should work hand in hand like that. Now this is going to be motion through that same triad with a lot of passing motion, 2 passing tones. Now we come to this note here, which does not relate by step to this one. So we could try and connect it in like this, but scale degree 6 is not a part of this 7 chord, and it doesn't find resolution anywhere. So you could make a case for it. You could say, well, it's like 7 with its with its seventh, the chordal seventh. That's true. Scale degree 6 would fit a 7 diminished 7 chord. This would be half diminished 7 chord. So you could make a case that way, but here's another way that I think I would prefer. I would make it more like an escape tone, 5, 6, 4, 3, 2. Now if I want to show that interpretation, see, neither one's wrong. You have to decide how you want to perform it. If you do something that kind of lets it go, da dee da 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 da, like that, then you want to do what I just did. But if you want to go Alma Del Cor spiel tu, and you want to join that 6 to the next thing that comes next, well then you don't want to do what I wrote. You want to show the slur that I had at first. It's your call though, and you have to decide which performance you like better. And when I'm done, there are 2 more details. Let me fill those in. I need a slur here, and I need a slur here. The reason I say that is because I need to be able to take any note, even this little detail, this neighbor tone here, and see how it relates to the things around it. And until I put that slur there, its function isn't clarified. Okay, so when I'm all done, I should be able to take any note in this phrase, and I should be able to trace it back to this, the Ursatz, the core stuff of the phrase. So let's pick a note. How about a passing tone right over here? All right, so this note is elaborating these 2 notes that are linked back to this B and are part of this tonic. We've just related it back to one of the core elements, the opening tonic. Similarly, we could go over here and say, here's a B. That is an escape tone. It's related back to this 4. It departs from it, it elaborates it. And that 4 is part of this linear progression, this fundamental line, as most people would call it. But this is a specific kind of, well, the German is Zug. It's a linear progression. It's the melody progressing somewhere. And in Shenkerian thought, that's to go down by step, from one member of the tonic triad to another eventually, but here we're interrupted. So that is a fundamental element, this line, 5, 4, 3, 2, and we can see how this note relates to one of those members, and then that in turn actually relates back to your tonic. And this is how that's true. If this is it's called a 5 line because it starts on 5, and because that's going to involve, eventually when it gets to closure, it's going to involve 5 elements too. But it's like this, 5 line. That's the kind of Urlini we're dealing with, the kind of fundamental line. Since you can start from any note in the tonic triad, there are also 3 lines, and there are octave lines as well. Line is Zug in German. So if you hear that word, that's what they're talking about. Okay, so a 5 line starts on 5, gets down to 1. Of course, there's a 3 in there in the middle somehow. But its motion is from 5 to 1. I'm going to use that slur to show belonging. I could do this as well. And if we're going 1, and I need a dominant in my Bassbrechung or bass arpeggiation, and that 5 needs to come back to 1. See how I need to add that 2 to have something to correspond to that 5. And maybe we use, maybe a dominant 7th in the middle, and I don't know, maybe we can start fleshing it out in a lot of different ways. In this case, it was different, but let me just make the main points to get back into the details. The main idea is that no matter how you harmonize these notes, the core thing is to move from a note of the tonic to another note of the tonic. So let me just erase some of this detail. That is the main idea right there. And yes, you're supporting some passing motion in the melody by that 5, but that motion, because it starts on 5 and 1, ends on 1, can be viewed as originating from this interval, 5 to 1, with passing motion in between. In other words, it all relates back to your opening tonic. If you think of your opening tonic as having inside it a 1 and a 5, what this phrase is doing is it's playing that out over time. It's stretching that out. So it takes this one right here and bumps it out over to this spot, and then finds a way to move through passing motion down to that one. But that one is part of that opening tonic. So you can see how really the Borg analogy might be appropriate here, because the tonic is assimilating all this stuff. You're relating that stepwise motion in the Urlini, you're relating it back to those boundary tones and saying, hey, it's passing motion between two notes of the tonic triad, and so it's really that the tonic triad has been played out over time. And that's kind of the core idea behind Schenker's thought, is that you can take something that could have just been a verticality and you can stretch it out over time, you can elaborate it, you can embellish. And so when we're looking at music, we're trying to see what's embellishing what. How are the core elements that make phrases tonal, like the tonic, the unit tonic, how are those things elaborated in time? That's our goal.